Finally, Joseph from Hartford, Connecticut. For as long as I can remember, Vince McMahon has always been portrayed as this ruthless boss in real life. My question is, was he always like this? When I look at him during the 80s and 90s, before his real-life battles with Bret Hart, it seemed like he was sort of a pushover. For example, when Bret Hart hit him and knocked his headset off his head on Raw, the Vince McMahon of today would have kicked somebody's ass for doing that, but back when Bret did it, it looked like he was scared, and we all know the story of Bret giving him the black eye. Once he became Mr. McMahon on TV, it started to sound like his on-screen character was living beyond the ring. I know you don't know him personally, but do you think his on-screen character took over his backstage personality, or was he always the ruthless SOB that we hear about? Well, first of all, you mentioned Bret knocking the headset off his head. That was an angle. That was an angle and a storyline from Raw. It went down exactly as it was supposed to. Vince was an announcer at the time, but I think people were pretty well, it was pretty well acknowledged that he was also the owner of the company. And I don't know, Vince did stand up to him. If you remember, him and Bret, he pulled Bret's shirt over his head like it was a hockey fight. It wasn't like Vince just stood there and took the abuse. He fought back. But he was also 50-something years old. He was the 50-something-year-old owner and announcer. What was he supposed to do? Knock Bret Hart out? Bret was his top draw at the time. You got to protect your top guys. You can't look tougher than them. I think Vince kind of lost track of that later on when he actually morphed into the Mr. McMahon character and started wrestling matches on TV. But was he always the ruthless SOB? Of course he was. You make him out to sound like he was some kind of teddy bear. I'm sure with his family and his friends in real life, he's a swell guy, and he does a lot of good things and charitable things, and I'm not saying he's like an evil person, but to insinuate that like back in the 80s and 90s, he was this giant teddy bear of a guy, and he always did right by people. This is the guy who put every single territory out of business. He crushed every single competitor of his in the 80s. Killed them all off. Yeah, the same guy, was a Black Friday, I think, or Black Saturday on the Superstation, when, he bought out the Briscoe share of Georgia Championship Wrestling and sent the tape in and said, from now on, we're airing WWF stars on your station. And of course, all the NWA fans, they put up a big fuss, and that didn't last very long. All of the things that Vince did, all the underhanded things he did, not to mention all the scandals back then. Believe me, he was not an innocent guy. He was always ruthless. Think of all the people he put out of business in the 80s. You're going to tell me he wasn't ruthless? He only became ruthless when his character took over in the late 90s? No. His character in the late 90s was an extended, amplified version of Vince McMahon. And he went all the way. He went way over the top as far as being this vindictive, heartless bastard. I don't think he's a vindictive, heartless bastard, behind the scenes, but that ruthlessness was always there. It was always there. And it goes back to the 80s. It goes back to when he took over from his father. It wasn't something that just cropped up in the late 90s. Wow, Vince really changed. No, he was always like that. That's what I think.